Hello everyone, welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 21, and actually I'm reviewing two books today. So I'm reviewing a novel called 100 Shadows by Hwang Jungeun, translated by Chong Ye-won and published by Tilted Axis Press, or just Tilted Axis. And I'm also reviewing a short story by Hwang Jungeun called Kong's Garden. The Korean title is Yangi Mire. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And the translator for Kong's Garden is Chon Seung-hee. So I'm reviewing two books by the same writer today. And Tilted Axis is the publishing company started by Deborah Smith. Deborah Smith is the translator who won the Booker International Prize for translating Han Gang's The Vegetarian. And actually this volume has a very nice little introduction essay, a little introduction foreword by Han Gang, which highlights some of the issues and themes in the novel. It's very interesting, and Tilted Axis published lots of great Korean novels, and novels from other places as well. Kong's Garden is part of the Asia Publishers collection, and there are these fantastic bilingual books. I don't know if you can see, but these wonderful bilingual books. So you get the Korean text and you get the English text, and you might be able to see this is the entire Asia Publishers K-fiction collection. Asia Publishers also do these red books, the Library of Modern Korean Literature, but this is like the sort of contemporary fiction. And so Kong's Garden is a good example of contemporary Korean fiction and a great short story. We'll talk about that second. But first of all, we're going to start with 100 Shadows. And in my last review that I did, in episode 20, I talked about Kim Sak-hwa's Mina. And I said that Mina was a Hell Choson novel. It was published in 2008. And 100 Shadows came out a couple of years later. It was published in 2010. And it's also very much a novel that we could call one of those sort of zeitgeist-defining Hell Choson novels from that sort of late 2000s, early 2010s period. And Hwang Jungeun is even more identified with this sort of idea of Hell Choson, and in fact she's been called the voice of the Hell Choson generation. And at the time when this book came out, she was one of the the rising stars of Korean literature, a sort of rising star among the young Korean writers at the time. And I think she's written at least 3 novels and a couple of short story collections. And these novels and short story collections, they she got a lot of critical acclaim, and the critics loved her work, and she also was very successful commercially. Lots of people became fans of her work and bought her books, and she got a lot of followers and supporters, and it was generally thought that she became so successful because she was tapping into the fears and desires of South Korea's the generation of disaffected youth in the 2000s. And she was sort of seen as being at the forefront of a group of relatively young writers whose work was exploring and embodying many of these ideas that are associated with Hell Choson, and the Hell Choson view of modern Korean society, especially for young people. And I actually reviewed this book a couple of years ago for a radio station, and when I reviewed the book, I found this great quote that sort of summarized and explained the Hell Choson phenomenon. And the quote's from the Korea Times. It's a newspaper here, but when I went back to try and find exactly who wrote the article that it came from, I can't actually find it anymore. So I apologize to the anonymous writer who wrote this Korea Times article that this quote came from. But this quote that I'll read here, it does a really fantastic job of summarizing, what Hell Choson is. So the term Hell Choson came to prominence in the early 2010s after a corruption scandal involving the country's then foreign minister securing a high-profile job for his daughter. Very common story here in Korea. There's been other bigger scandals to do with this as well. This minister eventually lost his job, and the term was picked up and embraced by Korean netizens. Hell Choson groups and forums spread across social media, where disgruntled users could post examples of unfair treatment and abuses of privilege. By 2015, Hell Choson was increasingly used as shorthand for a litany of ills blighting the lives of struggling Koreans. It refers to a view of Korea as a highly regimented and regressive society trapped in an ancient feudal-like system which forces individuals through a gruelingly competitive education system in the desperate hope of securing a good job, of which there seem to be fewer and fewer. It's an excellent summary of some of the key issues associated with Hell Choson, and it's a great way to start thinking about today's book. And it includes this idea that the wealthy, the powerful, the famous, they can sidestep the sort of relentless, dehumanizing grind, but those who can't, those who aren't rich or powerful or famous, they can't escape this. And there are lots of people who slip through the cracks of this sort of grossly unfair system, and they're sort of pushed to the fringes of society, where they're often forgotten and marginalized by mainstream society. And Hwang Jungeun, as the voice of the Hell Choson generation, she's writing stories about these people, right? She writes novels and short stories, for and about these, ostensibly, forgotten people who've been marginalized by the education system, by the sort of competitive employment situation in Korea, and so on, right? And so her work, the stories that she writes, these two novels, 100 Shadows, Kong's Garden, and her other books, they're populated by poor people who've been abused or neglected or abandoned or even homeless. And these were her first two works translated into English. I think they were the first two. This was certainly the first novel that she had translated into English. But they depict the lives of struggling temporary workers, so people working in temporary employment with temporary contracts. They've no security. They maybe don't have the best education. They didn't have the best educational opportunities. They don't have the best career prospects, and they're maybe also in unstable relationships, or they don't have a stable family situation. And like I said, so 100 Shadows was published in 2010, and it really people felt that it sort of captured the zeitgeist at the time, the sort of feeling that seemed to be in the air among young Korean people. And it became a bestseller in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. It tells the story of Eun-gyo. Eun-gyo is a young woman, and she works at a small repair shop called Mr. Yo's in a rundown and increasingly derelict electronics market that the government is trying to close down for redevelopment. We learn that Eun-gyo was seriously, bullied quite viciously by her classmates at high school. And this is a recurring trope or convention that you'll see in lots of Korean dramas and movies and other novels, that this sort of really vicious, nasty and unpleasant high school bullying. It really genuinely seems to be a fact of life. And Eun-gyo is an example of this. She's been a victim of this really unpleasant bullying, to such an extent that she drops out of school. She decides that she can't tolerate this the bullying that she experiences every day, and so she drops out of school. And so she's working at this electronics market, and this is where she first meets Moo-jae. Moo-jae is a young man who's working as a kind of an apprentice in a transformer shop. And the story of how Moo-jae ended up working in this electronics market is also tinged with tragedy. So his father made a bad business decision and fell into debt. And in order to pay the interest, he just sort of keeps falling further and further into debt until his life is consumed by this sort of vicious circle of debt payments and rising interests. And Muji's father dies, and Muji inherits this debt. And so he's sort of lumbered with this debt, this sort of huge responsibility that he can't cope with. He's sort of struggling to deal with that situation. Some readers of this novel, if you look online, this book has a lot of fans, and some of the sort of fandom around this book, they like to see it as a love story between Muji and Eun-gyo. And their relationship, it is tender and it's affecting, and it does appear like it's constantly poised to tip over into something more than friendship. It's actually, this romantic description is actually something that Hwang, in interviews, has resisted. It isn't a completely, a romantic relationship. But anyway, over the course of the story, Eun-gyo and Muji's, sort of faltering relationship progresses, and as their relationship develops, the prospect of redevelopment for the electronics market and upheaval and general economic uncertainty and loss of livelihood for the people who work in the electronics market, it just sort of hangs over everybody. It's just like in the background all the time. And the government starts pushing the tenants out and closing down sections of the market, and it seems like the noose is sort of slowly tightening around the necks of those who are left, the people who are still struggling to stay there, even as the government tries to push them out. So what can they do? Where can they go? And how will they survive? One of the fascinating things about 100 Shadows is that it's inspired by real locations in Seoul, as well as real events that have happened in recent history. And it's also inspired by Hwang's own activism to do with some of these types of events. So what events is Hwang drawing on when she wrote this story? So if you read some of the interviews, you can find several great interviews online where Hwang talks about the fact the novel is inspired by real locations, real events, as well as her own upbringing. So the electronic market in 100 Shadows was based on two similar markets in Seoul. So the Sewon electronics market in Jongno and the Yongsan electronic market, both of which have now been substantially redeveloped. I've been to the Yongsan electronic market several times. I haven't been there since the pandemic. I've no idea what it looks like now, but certainly 4 or 5 years ago, it was still sort of going through this process of redevelopment. I'd love to go back and see what it looks like now. But anyway, Hwang's father worked in one of these markets, repairing audio equipment. He worked there for 4 decades. So Hwang grew up around the traders that worked there and occupied the units there. And she witnessed the first of the buildings getting demolished for redevelopment in 2008. And many of the small businesses in 100 Shadows, so there's a light bulb seller who features in the story, there's a repair shop, there's Muji's transformer workshop. These are all based directly on real locations. And I think that the novel has this sort of feeling of just casual authenticity. And I think it's because she grew up in this environment and she knows this environment very well. And Hwang's also frequently spoken about writing the novel, as a direct response to the so-called Yongsan tragedy that happened on January 20th, 2009. And there's an incredible documentary that you can see about the Yongsan tragedy. If you search online, you'll probably be able to find it. And what happened was, as the area was in Yongsan around the electronics market was being redeveloped, several residents occupied one of the buildings listed for redevelopment to protest, what the government was doing in the neighborhood. So they barricaded themselves in a building that was, scheduled for destruction, and they fought off the police for several days. This went on for quite some time. Eventually, the police stormed the building and set it on fire, and 5 protesters died, and a police officer died. And obviously, it was a huge scandal and a tragedy. and the area around the fire came to be known as Namildang. And after the fire, demonstrators started gathering in that area, and they did so for several weeks to protest the deaths of the residents, and just to protest against the government for this sort of redevelopment and what was happening there. And like many other citizens in Korea at the time, Hwang saw the events, as they transpired on TV, and she wrote 100 Shadows in the summer to autumn of that year when that happened. And she says that she would write during the day until the sun went down, and then she'd go and attend the protests, the Namildang protests in the evening. Now, although inspired by those real events and these places that she was very familiar with, 100 Shadows is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a straightforward realist novel. So Hwang actually blends this sort of very interesting and curious element of fantasy into the narrative. There's a very unusual little device that she uses. The novel is rooted in this real life tragedy, rooted in genuine economic issues, but it isn't simply a work of sort of straightforward social realism. And it's also not an angry novel. You might expect a novel that came out of attending these protests and those circumstances to be an angry novel, but it isn't an angry, it doesn't seem like an angry novel. It uses this kind of surreal, almost sort of fantasy-like device to express the death, the despair, and the helplessness that she sort of witnessed and experienced in the aftermath of the Namildang protests. The novel starts with Eun-gyo, witnessing her shadow starting to rise. This is the word that they use. Your shadow starts to rise. And in the reality of the story, it's generally accepted that when your shadow rises, it represents something very bad, some kind of turning point in your life. And so in the novel, the people's shadows will, literally sort of follow them about. And for many people, this starts happening at the moment when they're defeated by life. The pivotal moment, the final straw, some final thing happens where they sort of lose their ability to be optimistic about life. They've been defeated by life. They've resigned themselves to whatever hardship it is that they're suffering, and at that moment their shadow rises, and it's sort of a kind of symbolic, a symbolic death. And these shadows, they take on this almost semi-physical presence in people's lives and literally haunt them. They'll sometimes be sitting beside the person, or when the person's sleeping, the shadow will, lie on top of them, but they're almost this sort of physical presence in a person's life. The characters are, they're aware of this, they fear their shadows, and Eun-gyo is repeatedly warned in the story not to follow her shadow if she sees it rise. It's a, kind of a wonderfully, surreal and evocative image, very unusual, and it's sort of open to a variety of possible interpretations. And it's just a very interesting device, and the people can respond to it in all sorts of different ways. Another thing that we see in this novel, and we see in Hwang's other stories, is that she's very concerned with the lives of young women, and she clearly thinks it's important to write about the lives of young women. Many of the themes that we see in 100 Shadows, we can also see in Kong's Garden. And again, this is another story of a young woman, working on the fringes of society and struggling with her role in life. And the Korean title, so you can see the Korean title there, the Korean title is Yangi Mire. And I suppose it literally translates as something like, what's Yang's future, or what's going to happen to Yang. And Yang has a couple of different meanings. It can sometimes mean young woman, and I think sometimes also Yang is sheep, right? And so it's sort of Yang's future. What is Yang's future? What is a young woman's future? And in a writer's note in Kong's Garden, so one of the good things about these Asia Publishers editions is you often have essays by the author or by a literary critic, and there's a nice author's note in Kong's Garden where Hwang says that her work, her job, is to write about these young women who live on the fringes, who always have to work in menial jobs and who are often ignored and sidelined and forgotten. She says that she finds herself thinking about these girls and asking herself, how did she spend her day to day? How will she spend it tomorrow? And, and giving, voice to these characters, characters like Eun-gyo in 100 Shadows, and to the main character in Kong's Garden. Hwang's kind of become this sort of poet laureate for Korea's forgotten young people. She really is a talented writer. These are, super interesting stories. And I highly recommend both of them. So today, the first book we talked about today was 100 Shadows, translated by Chong Ye-won, and the second book we talked about was Kong's Garden, translated by Chon Seung-hee, both by Hwang Jungeun, both fantastic, highly recommend them both. Hwang Jungeun has one other novel, at least as far as I'm aware, she has only one other novel available in English translation called I'll Go On. Also a super interesting book, and I'll try to get around to reading that at some point soon. But anyway, this was episode 21. Thank you for watching, and take care, and I'll see you back here in episode 22.